Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Great Gatsby, and specifically, I'm going to be talking about the character of our narrator, Nick Carraway, and his progression and his growth as a character. Now, most first person narratives, anything written in the first person using the pronoun I, is really always moving in a specific direction. It's really all about the growth or the realization of the narrator. Usually, when authors choose to begin with a first person narrative, the narrator is going to tell you about a time and how this time has affected him and how him or her and how they have grown as a person. So, even though the book is called The Great Gatsby, I would argue that the book is really more about Nick than it is Gatsby. Gatsby is the subject of the book, but at its core, I think The Great Gatsby is about the growth of Nick Carraway. And here's why I think this. Fitzgerald begins the novel with a very important observation on behalf of the narrator. The narrator seems, in its opening moments, to have a lot of self-realization, to understand what they really are like, to understand themselves. Nick tells us right from the beginning that his father has told him since he was a child that whenever he felt like judging anybody, he should hold himself back because he should understand that not everybody has had the advantages that he's had growing up. This is, of course, good advice. No one can argue with that. And Nick then will go on to tell us that because he is inclined to reserve judgments, because he's not a judgmental person, many people seek him out and want to tell him their secrets and confide in him, probably because they know that he's not the type of person to pass judgment on him. Now, on its surface, those qualities seem to be very good, positive attributes to your character. But later on in that opening little section, Nick will tell us, having said that, I will say it has a limit. And then he speaks kind of abstractly about what's going to be coming up in the narrative. And he says it has something to do with morality. And so that kind of sets the tone. But when we first read it in the beginning of the novel, if it's your first read, you don't quite understand what he means. That's why I sometimes like to go back after I've read a book and go back and look at how the author chose to begin it. Sometimes you have a little more insight as to why the author said what the author said. And this is the case with Nick. Now, Nick tells us about his background. He comes from the Midwest. He comes from a place of, in this book, Gatsby, directionality has some symbolism associated with it. It seems like the West is associated with traditional moral values, and as you move east, we become in what I call moral jeopardy. So Nick moves symbolically from the West to the New York City area, and in doing so, he's going to put himself into a place where he's going to have to decide where his own morality stands. He's not going to have those traditional moral values as a backbone. He's going to have to, find his own moral fortitude and integrity. Similarly, East Egg and West Egg, we have that same thing working on. West Egg is more moral than East Egg, although one might argue that there's not a whole lot of morality at all. But certainly East Egg, which is the more fashionable of the two and is associated with old money like the Buchanans, there seems to be less moral responsibility associated with the East than there is with the West, which is where Gatsby and Nick live. So Nick begins telling us that he is the type of person that reserves judgments. And in chapter 2, though, we see an interesting event. We see Nick go into New York with Tom Buchanan. Now remember that Tom is the husband of Nick's distant cousin, Daisy. And we know that Tom is having an affair on Daisy because he got that phone call during their dinner party. Nevertheless, chapter 2 involves Nick traveling with Tom. They go into New York. They pick up his mistress, or kind of pick her up, and then head off to an apartment where a small, intimate group of people are going to party. And Nick just goes along with it. I mean, maybe it didn't occur to you as you were reading it, but there is something sketchy about going with the husband of your cousin and being there witnessing this affair take place. And Nick just seems to say, yeah, I don't make judgments, whatever. He doesn't even make a judgment when Tom breaks Myrtle's nose and that party ends in an act of violence. Nick just puts on his hat, makes his way home. Now, if you're reading carefully, I think the reader has to question, is that not making a judgment? Or is that moral cowardice? Which one is it? Because in just being present with Tom and Myrtle in this affair, isn't Nick somewhat condoning it? And perhaps he's hiding behind his inability to make judgments because he just doesn't want to make a moral stand. Later on in the book, Nick will develop a romantic relationship with Jordan. And Jordan is from the world of the old rich. And although she is very attractive to Nick, and he really feels himself really very much attracted to her, there are some initial problems. And these problems initially come to rise during a conversation about driving. Nick is a passenger in a car as Jordan's driving. She almost clips some guy on the side of the road. And Nick tells her, you're a terrible driver. And she says, yeah, well, I don't need to be careful because other people will be. This in itself kind of encapsulates the whole idea of the old rich, this carelessness that pervades their world. They don't need to be morally responsible because that's for other people. Nick says to her, well, what if you run into another careless driver? And she says, I hope I won't. I hate careless people. So this lack of self-knowledge that is in Jordan does not escape Nick. As the story unfolds, Gatsby approaches Jordan and asks her to speak to Nick about setting up a rendezvous between Gatsby and Daisy. So not only is Nick now kind of condoning the affair between Tom and Myrtle, but now he's asked to play a role in getting these two people together so that they can have an affair. He turns to Jordan and goes, well, what do you think? Should I? And Jordan says, well, Tom has a lover, so I think Daisy should be able to have one too. And that's the morality. And so Nick, doesn't pass judgments, just goes along with it and, allows this kind of thing to kind of happen. So interestingly enough, my hair is doing some weird stuff. Interestingly enough, Nick is the kingpin that kind of makes this happen. Then he kind of pulls away. Gatsby and Daisy develop an affair. And Nick is also present at some other awkward situations. And the most awkward one of all is when Gatsby is invited over to the Buchanan's house. Now, this is how bold the people of the Buchanan world are. Not only do they have affairs, but they flaunt them. Daisy, Tom literally invites Nick along with the trip so he can party with his mistress. Daisy actually invites her lover over to her house in front of her husband to have a party. They just think they can do anything. Now, Tom is uncomfortable in this situation, and even Gatsby is uncomfortable being in Tom's house. And he tells Nick, I can't say anything here because, I'm in his house. I can't do that. That shows that Gatsby has a little more morality than the Buchanans, for sure. Nick just feels like this is a situation that he just wants to get out of. The scene in the hotel room turns bad quickly as all of the main players confront one another. And Gatsby tries to get Daisy to just confess that she's never loved Tom and everything can go right back to the way it was years ago. As we know, Daisy is unable to do that. And when they head back into New York, now the main characters are driving different vehicles than they were when they arrived. And Nick witnesses the carnage of the carelessness of the rich when he sees Myrtle's body, right out there on the side of the road. He is profoundly affected by that. Now, of course, the accident with the automobile is foreshadowed by that careless scene at the party early on where the Owl Eyes and his partner, kind of drove off the road and the wheel came off the car. And it seemed funny then because no one was hurt. Now, the automobile is often a symbol of American wealth and privilege, so it is fitting that this is the instrument that kills Myrtle at the hands of a careless driver, Daisy. Nick is at first angry because he thinks that Gatsby was the one driving. When he learns that Gatsby was not driving and that Daisy was driving and Daisy didn't even stop, he's starting to reevaluate things, I think. When he gets out of the car that night, after they've driven past the accident that killed Myrtle, Jordan gets out of the car and she's just very flippant about it. She's like, okay, well, do you want to come inside? You want to get something to eat? A little snack? Nick's like, no, I don't actually. He's kind of, I think, disgusted and appalled by Jordan's flippancy in that moment. He's probably further disgusted when he sees the poor sap Gatsby hiding in the bushes thinking he's protecting Daisy. And Nick goes around the front of the house to see what's going on inside, and he sees Daisy and Tom engaged in some kind of a confident, this confidential conversation huddled over fried chicken. And it doesn't look like either of them really care that a woman has just been killed. I think that's an important point in the novel where Nick is really beginning to see his reluctance to pass judgments as perhaps more cowardice than anything else. Fitzgerald also makes an important decision to have Nick turn 30 throughout the course of this novel. 30 is an important number because really at about that age, that's when you really have to start adulting. Up until then, your mistakes can be attributed to youth and inexperience. But by the time you're 30, I think that's when you really have to kind of decide for yourself what's right and wrong. And that's probably why after this whole thing ends and Gatsby dies, Nick plans Gatsby's funeral. And remember, he doesn't have any obligation to do so. After all, he just met this guy not that long ago. They've not been friends forever. He's not related to him. They didn't have a particularly close friendship. And in the beginning, Nick didn't even like him. After all, Gatsby is a liar. He's a fraud. He's a con man. And he's probably a criminal. Despite all that, though, Gatsby appears as more admirable than the Buchanans because all of the decisions that he makes are driven by this huge, deep love for Daisy. Now, Gatsby's got it all wrong. He goes about it all wrong. But everything he does is driven by his love for another human being, as opposed to the Buchanans, where everything they do is driven by their love for themselves. They do not seem to have the capacity for love that Gatsby has. I think Nick is starting to see all this. And that's why he says to Gatsby in his last meeting with him, "You're worth the whole damn bunch put together." That was an important moment in the book because in that moment, Nick made a judgment. He didn't reserve judgment. He made a judgment. And the judgment he made was, Gatsby, you are better than the rest of them all combined. He says he's always been glad that he said that to him because shortly after that, Gatsby lies dead. And Nick picks up the pieces of the carelessness that has caused this Holocaust, as he puts it. He plans Gatsby's funeral, which he doesn't have to do. He's almost desperate to find attendance for the funeral. He tracks down Gatsby's dad, and he makes a concerted effort to get people to come, but nobody comes. And I think that's another important moment when Nick understands more clearly than ever the shallowness that wealth can cause. After the funeral, Nick makes another important decision. He decides he's leaving. He's going back west. And his decision there is symbolic as well, because remember, we're associating the West with a greater degree of moral responsibility than the East. So his decision to leave this world of the East and go west is perhaps a decision for him to turn his back on the immorality that he has been engulfed in during his time with the Buchanans and Gatsby. Before he goes, he has a final conversation with Jordan, and it goes back to that careless driving conversation. And she says, I met another careless driver. At one point he says to her, I'm 30 years old. That's 5 years too old to lie to myself and call it honor. In that moment, Nick seems to understand that he didn't understand himself very well in the beginning of the book. There was a certain moral superiority to Nick in the beginning when he bragged about his fact that he doesn't judge other people and, he seems to leave that to other people. I think he starts to understand that sometimes you need to make a judgment. Sometimes you need to stand up for what's right. And failing to do so isn't always good. Sometimes it's moral cowardice, not tolerance. So he seems to have understood that about himself and understood that he kind of was lying to himself earlier when he called himself honest. Maybe he wasn't being as honest to himself as he thought he was being. Maybe he really was hiding behind his father's advice and not taking a stand when he saw things happen that were clearly immoral. So in the end, I think that the person who has really changed, the only character who has really changed or grown throughout this narrative, is the narrator, Nick Carraway. Gatsby dies waiting for Daisy's phone call. He dies, still committed to this goal, which was misguided but well-intentioned. The Buchanans, they just run away as they always do when they've done something wrong, leaving someone else to clean up the mess, in this case, Nick. And Jordan certainly hasn't changed at all either. So the only one who's really changed and learned anything is really Nick. Nick takes the knowledge he has learned and he has a newfound cynicism to himself. He is discouraged about human nature. But I think we can definitely say that he himself is a better man than he was in the beginning of the book. Thank you for watching, and I hope this video will help you in your study of The Great Gatsby. Thanks again.